This is going to be one of the hardest videos I've ever had to make. No, it's not an apology video. It's a review of a Nagisa Oshima film. And I guess I don't have to make this video, but ever since I reviewed Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence last year, I knew I needed to watch some more movies by this mercurial director. To be honest, that movie kind of bamboozled me. I had some things to say about it in the review, but the core of that movie, the truth of it, the reason why it made such a lasting impression on me was never something I could put into words. Maybe that showed a little bit in the review, I'm not sure. With this movie, In the Realm of the Senses, Nagisa Oshima has done it again. I say again, but this movie is from before that one. It came out in 1976, although you probably wouldn't guess that just from watching the movie. Before we go any further, I should warn you that this movie is rated NC-17, and for more than one reason. You might describe it as an erotic movie. It features a lot of unsimulated sex. This movie has had its fair share of controversy, possibly more than its fair share of controversy. Even today, some people debate whether it is art or pornography. To me, that is an incredibly boring question, so we're going to skip it. Also, the answer is kind of obvious. In addition to all the sex, this movie also has a couple of moments of extremely graphic violence. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, hey, sex and violence, this movie sounds great, let me warn you that the movie is also really boring. The main reason I would not recommend the film to people is not the NC-17 rating, although that is significant, and again, please note, very graphic movie. You've been warned. But the main reason why I would maybe direct some people away from this is more that it's just another unconventional and somewhat mystifying film from Nagisa Oshima. I'm not going to gatekeep anybody from this movie. If you want to watch it, if it sounds interesting to you, you should go watch it. But it's kind of a challenging movie. Just look at all the polarizing reviews. This movie is rated 6.6 on IMDb, which is much lower than it should be, I think. Or if it were just me voting, the score would be a bit higher. I've seen a few theaters in New York City screening this film recently, so maybe it's about to have a resurgence, although I really don't know what today's audience will make of In the Realm of the Senses. I'm not sure exactly where to start with this movie, so let's start with the style. First, there's the music. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. That movie is defined by Ryuichi Sakamoto. He wrote an incredible score for it, and in a great twist, he also stars in the movie. That score is really in-your-face 1980s synthesizer stuff, even though the movie takes place during World War II, when the synthesizer was not particularly popular. This movie, In the Realm of the Senses, does not have the same kind of big in-your-face score. Instead, it's music that I would best describe as traditional. At first, I was a little bit disappointed by this, but it grew on me. I went into this movie knowing almost nothing about it. I knew it was rated NC-17, don't worry. And I think for some reason that made me assume that it was going to be set in the present. I thought, wow, if this is an edgy movie that really pushed the envelope, it must be set in the present. No, it isn't. This is also a historical film, and the score is far from the only traditional element here. In some ways, this movie feels almost like a samurai movie. It has a very restricted geography. You're not going to see a bunch of big city skylines. You're not really going to see anything other than a few buildings, or really a few bedrooms and a few mattresses. This film was mainly filmed on sets, it seems, and it reminds you in some ways of these sort of samurai parable films. But like I said, this film is kind of out of time in many ways. It doesn't really feel like 1976. There's a few moments that remind me of 1966, some of the radical modernist Japanese films that are out there. But if you told me that this movie came out in 1996, I would also believe that. It's kind of hard to tell also when the movie is set, when it takes place. It feels like it's a long time ago until someone rides on a somewhat modern-looking train. I don't think it's a spoiler for me to tell you that it's set in 1936, but that's not obvious for most of the movie. That's interesting. Now, it's no mistake, I think, that this movie is stylistically a little tricky to pin down. It leans a little bit towards being a parable, but it also goes completely in the opposite direction in some ways. I'll talk about some of the defining tensions of the movie shortly, but it's worth noting here that we feel this ambiguity that kind of defines a lot of parts of the movie. Well, it's there in the style, too. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence is also in between a few different things, and when I was first watching it, I wasn't really sure what I was looking at. Same experience here. This is probably part of the Oshima magic. And if you're sitting there looking for various genre signifiers to hang on to, you might be disappointed. You might not come away with a coherent view of the movie, but just hang in there, and I think the language of it will start to click for you. The last thing about the style is that this movie looks pretty cool, but I wouldn't say it's the slickest cinematography out there exactly. If you're looking for a superlative, I would say that it is piercing. And I don't quite understand how Oshima is doing this, but there are some simple shots where not much is really happening, that just hit you like a ton of bricks. If you're keyed into this movie, it is ridiculously engaging just because of the tensions and the texture and the feel. Even when not much is happening, it really pulls you in. It has a certain magnetism, maybe coming partly from the actors. Of course, we could talk about how Oshima films the sex in the movie. It's not exactly glamorous. Actually, I think there's a profound ambiguity here as well between something beautiful and sacred and something unsettling or shameful. This is maybe a big part of the movie. It's part of the narrative, but you also feel it really viscerally in how the film is shot and how this erotic subject is addressed. Before we go any farther, we have to talk a little bit about the ending. I'm not going to spoil this movie, but I'm talking about all this ambiguity and all this tension, and some of you might be thinking, what? Did he not get to the end? Did he not finish it? Because we have a somewhat didactic ending to this movie. Not exactly didactic, but it's an ending that sort of closes off some of this ambiguity, sort of puts a foot on the scale of some of the back and forth. Maybe. If you've seen Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, you might remember that that movie also has kind of a decisive ending. At the time, I was a little bit confused by this. The ending isn't bad, and it isn't without nuance. I think it's a good ending, but if you take it at face value, you might be a little bit confused. That's another movie that is so beautiful and so ambiguous. When you get to the end, you might wonder, oh, is that what this was all about? With this movie, the ending seems, in some ways, really conclusive. You know what I mean if you've seen the movie. But I would caution you about thinking about it too decisively. Maybe the ending isn't as much a conclusion as it is just another facet of the story, another piece of a puzzle that happens to be the last one. There's nothing special about the last piece of the puzzle. You just happen to put it, there at the end. Interesting to think about. The ending of this movie is interesting. I'm going to let these ambiguities breathe because this is one of the things that really resonated with me about the movie. And even though at the end it sort of leans back into parable land a little bit, I think we got to take the whole movie together. Maybe. I don't know. Some people might think that's bonkers, but let me know. I mentioned already that this movie is straddling some ambiguities, and I guess I already mentioned one thing, which is the intimacy in the film being sort of sacred and also sort of corrosive. Something that is attached to this is the collision of the private lives and the public lives of Sada and Kichizo. These are the main characters. I'll attempt to say their names. You might think of Japan in 1936 as a conservative society. You might think of Japan today as a conservative society. And at first, this couple is fairly secretive about their affair. Of course, Sada works at some kind of brothel, which I think was legal. The workers there are watching through the cracks in the doors. The walls are paper thin. They hear everything. So maybe it's a strict society, but there's also this unspoken world. There's a lot of open secrets. And as the movie goes on, we're going to see more and more of this. One of the jarring elements of this film is how unabashed this couple is. They have sex in front of the waitress at the brothel, then in front of the geisha, in front of the staff at the inn. And I'm not going to give anything away, but that is only the beginning. So is this sort of exhibitionism an act of radical progressivism, or is it a symptom of a dangerous sex addiction? I exaggerate somewhat, but it is unstable. It is unstable. You might feel that this movie is more on one side, maybe more on the negative side. It probably is, but I think this ambiguity is important. These tensions are not just the story of this couple, but intimacy is ambiguous. You don't have to be doing anything particularly unconventional to feel this. Just think about nudity itself. In some ways, it's the most basic thing there is. Humans are the only animals that wear clothes, I think. Remind me why that is, right? Why do we wear clothes again? Kind of a tricky question. In something as basic as our bodies, we have this tremendous shame, but also an allure and a beauty and an intimacy. Slightly hokey example, but this ambiguity is all over the place in the line between infatuation and obsession. Wait, is obsession a good thing or a bad thing? There's the allure and the shame of taboos, right? By the way, you might be tempted to read this movie in terms of modern fetishistic paradigms, kinks, if you will. In some ways, this doesn't really work because it's not using modern idioms. Nobody's wearing leather, for instance. But maybe the instability of intimacy resonates here as well. Like I said, the allure and the shame of taboos are part of this instability. You may also be tempted to read this in terms of gender politics. Sada has pretty limited choices in life, and is this relationship liberating for her? Is she forced into some kind of lifestyle by these social paradigms? Maybe, but I think this might lead to confusion. It's not how I read the movie, at least. I think this instability of intimacy is a core thing of the movie, maybe not in a didactic way, but like I said, this movie itself is so hard to read, is shifting so much as you watch it. It's so hard to latch onto and understand exactly what it is, and maybe that mirrors its subject in sort of a profound way. One thing that's interesting about the film is how impersonal it is. You might think that we're going to be searching for the psychological roots of this stuff, that we're going to figure out why Sada and Kichizo are so compelled. Oddly, though, we learn almost nothing about who these people are. This is probably yet another way that Oshima is resisting genre cues. I'm split a little bit about it, though. It kind of feels like there's some unanswered questions here, like you kind of want to know more about who these people are. On the other hand, it does shift the focus away from didactics, maybe bringing something more ethereal into focus. This movie is kind of like Last Tango in Paris if you removed all the scenes without Derry. To cap everything off, one thing I just almost couldn't believe is that this movie, like Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, is based on a true story. This has got to be the least historical film I have ever seen. It's not about facts. There's hardly a story, and yet there is such a piercing personal thing going on, or such an open and frank portrait of something profound in life. This is kind of where I start to run out of words. The best I can do with this movie is that it's in between a lot of stuff. It's sort of a parable, it's sort of a tragedy, it's sort of pornographic, and there, between all these forms that don't really come close to the real thing, we have desire, which itself is so shifty and beguiling. And maybe it's this desire itself, rather than any words that I can say, that is the language you speak when you're in the realm of the senses. That's basically all I can say without going in circles. I wouldn't recommend this movie to everyone. I would recommend it to some people. I wouldn't recommend it to everyone. And I wouldn't even say that I loved it exactly, but it is really compelling, and another movie that is going to stick in my mind for a long time, and another movie that absolutely scratches the itch of a cinephile who has seen too many movies. We will definitely be doing some more Oshima films on the channel, probably The Ceremony, I think. Let me know if you have any other recommendations, or if you've seen this movie. I would love to hear what you made of it.